Good evening. It's Thursday, the 16th of September. I'm Beverley O'Connor. Australia signs an historic security pact with the US and UK, paving the way for our nation to build nuclear-powered submarines. In tonight's special edition of The World, we'll take you through the deal, the implications on security in the region, get the international reaction and the impact on our already troubled relationship with China. It's been described as the most significant defence pact since the ANZUS Treaty of 1951. AUKUS, as it'll be known, builds on our existing alliance with the United States and Britain. But more importantly, it'll allow Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines for the very first time with access to secret US technology. It means Australia is tearing up its $90 billion diesel submarine deal with France. Leaders of the three countries were at pains to say the plan aims to promote peace and security in the Asia and Pacific region, not threaten it. But there's no doubt it's China's strengthening military positioning and growing assertiveness in the region that has propelled this deal forward. Beijing is condemning it as Cold War mentality and ideological prejudice. Tonight we'll delve further into the submarines themselves and get more analysis and international reaction. But first, here's our defence correspondent Andrew Green on how the day unfolded.
Well, good morning from Australia.
By dawn's early light, a coordinated, dramatic, strategic strike.
A new enhanced trilateral security partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States.
Leaders across three continents.
I want to thank that fellow down under. Thank you very much, pal. Appreciate it, Mr. Prime Minister.
Unveiling the biggest shift in this country's defence posture in decades.
Australia is one of our oldest friends, a kindred nation, and a fellow democracy and a natural partner.
And one that's been invited to join an exclusive nuclear club.
The first major initiative of AUKUS will be to deliver a nuclear-powered submarine fleet for Australia.
A top-secret submarine plan 18 months in the making, driven by fears of a rapidly growing military power in this region.
The relatively benign security environment that Australia has enjoyed over many decades in our region is behind us.
Torpedoing a $90 billion French deal for conventionally powered subs won't come cheap. Australia's already spent billions, but switching to nuclear will be far more expensive and complex.
It's an enormous amount of work we'll be doing in the coming 18 months, Prime Minister.
Paris was only informed last night, but told its former customer the shock decision shows a lack of coherence that France can only note and regret. Labor too was briefed yesterday and is giving qualified support.
That there be no requirement of a domestic civil nuclear industry. There be no acquisition of nuclear weapons. This agreement would be compatible with the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
This is a dangerous move that will make Australia less safe by putting floating Chernobyls in the heart of our major cities.
This is about propulsion. This is not about acquiring nuclear weapons.
Britain and America will help Australia design its new nuclear submarines, with at least 8 to be built in Adelaide. The first of the future fleet is expected to hit the water in the next decade. Before they arrive, more US submarines are likely to be stationed here. Unlocking its nuclear technology secrets is not something the US military machine does lightly. In fact, it's only happened once before, so there can be no turning back once that vault is flung open. Now, more than ever, Australia is tied to this security alliance with all the advantages that brings and the baggage too, in a neighbourhood bristling with tensions and rivalries. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
And as we heard in Andrew's report, today's announcement has not gone down well in France. The country's foreign minister says the scrapping of the $90 billion submarine deal is a betrayal.
c'est vraiment en bon français.
It really is a stab in the back. We built a relationship of trust with Australia, and this trust was betrayed. I'm angry today with a lot of bitterness about this breach of contract. This is not done between allies, especially when there's been 2 years of negotiations for this contract. We have an intergovernmental agreement that has been signed with all pomp and circumstance in 2019, with precise commitments and articles in this agreement. So we'll see how they get out of this. This is not the end of the story.
Not the end of the story. Well, let's go to our Europe correspondent, Steve Kinane, who joins us live out of London. Steve, the French are certainly not happy with this development. What sort of recourse do they have?
Well, it's hard to know exactly what the recourse will be at the moment. I'm assuming that they could somehow claim breach of contract. I think we'll find that out in the coming weeks and months. But you could hear the white-hot anger from Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French foreign minister, who himself is a former defence minister, so he knows this territory very well. They are angry for a number of different reasons. And if you look at it from their perspective, they've just had an ally, Australia, tear up a $90 billion contract. They see it that another ally, the US, has played an active role in undercutting that deal. And then they see another ally and long-term rival as well, Britain, is going to profit from it. There is that sense of betrayal. The French foreign minister said that he had spoken to his Australian counterpart in recent days and there was no mention of this contract being torn up. I think you've also got a loss of face going on here. There's been a lot of disputes and delays and blowouts around this build of these submarines in France, so it's embarrassing for the French government. And Bev, throw a dose of politics in there as well. Early next year, we're going to have a French presidential election. Emmanuel Macron will be running again, and one of his key rivals will be Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen is popular with blue-collar voters. She's an old-school protectionist. She pitches for these kind of jobs in the manufacturing industry as being very important for France, and I am sure that she will be making hay out of the fact that Emmanuel Macron has not been able to keep this contract. And if you think of that anger that we heard from the French foreign minister before, a lot of it is directed at the US. And in fact, in that radio interview, he compared President Biden with former President Trump. I'll read a quote to you, Bev. He said, "This brutal, unilateral, unpredictable decision looks very much like what Mr. Trump used to do. Allies don't do this to each other. It's rather insufferable."
Interesting indeed. And Steve, the UK Prime Minister has been taking questions on this morning in Parliament. How's he positioning the deal?
Well, he's selling it very much as something that is in the strategic interests of Britain. He says that Australia and the US and the UK all have shared interests and that this alliance will help protect those interests. And specifically, what he's talking about is Britain's renewed focus on the Indo-Pacific region. He says he described it as being becoming part of the geopolitical centre of the world and therefore very important for British trade interests. And he sees this as something that will protect trade and therefore jobs and livelihoods in the UK. Here's what he said in the UK House of Commons just a couple of hours ago.
While our partnership will begin with nuclear power submarines, now that we have created AUKUS, we expect to accelerate the development of other advanced defence systems, including in cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and undersea capabilities. It will help to safeguard the security of the Indo-Pacific, create jobs at home, and reinforce our country's place at the leading edge of technology.
Now, Bev, I know you know that there's a lot of dissent in the House of Commons, but on this issue there seemed to be broad support. Both Labor and the Liberal Democrats said they supported Boris Johnson and the UK government in this move. And that's what Boris Johnson was saying just a couple of hours ago in the Commons. Great to talk, Steve. Thanks so much. Steve Kinane there in our London bureau. Well, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has heralded the deal as a forever partnership between Australia's oldest and most trusted friends. The bold strategic move is likely to trigger further tensions with our largest trading partner, China. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
One single momentous decision reconfigures Australia's relationship between its oldest ally, Britain, its key security partner, the United States, and its biggest customer, China. Beijing has no doubt where Australia's allegiances lie, but by embracing US-British nuclear submarine technology, Australia entrenches its role as a regional foil against China's assertiveness.
It is not an uncommon thing for countries to take decisions in their own strategic interests and to build up their defence capabilities.
The fact the Prime Minister would risk offending the French by tearing up a $90 billion contract shows you how much the government believes the security environment's changed in just a few years. That June meeting in Cornwall between Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden was when this deal was forged. Turns out it might have been one of the most consequential meetings in recent times.
A forever partnership for a new time between the oldest and most trusted of friends.
Will the so-called AUKUS agreement inflame tensions with China? You bet.
US, UK and Australia are engaging in cooperation that gravely undermines regional peace and stability.
It'll see Australian and British submarines become a structural part of America's Indo-Pacific pivot to push back at President Xi Jinping's military play. But this audacious realignment has its hurdles, even with friends who don't like nuclear warships coming port side.
No vessel that is wholly or fully, partially or fully powered by nuclear energy is able to enter into our internal waters.
The PM wants Jacinda Ardern on side, if anything, to reassure regional neighbours nervy about Washington's wrestle with Beijing. Morrison's nuclear option set to be sealed next week alongside his British counterpart on a visit to the US.
Well, Jeff Bleish is the former US ambassador to Australia. He says the trilateral security partnership is not just about countering China.
Clearly, the focus is on ensuring free navigation. And so one of the issues that's arisen over the years has been China's desire to maintain exclusive control over what it refers to as South China Sea, and also its belligerence at times with respect to sea lanes. So China's clearly part of it, but they're not the only part of it. You know, the Straits of Malacca are a critical, trade path for our nations, and there have been other countries in the region that can also create mischief there. So it's clearly China's part of it, but it's not the whole story.
Well, let's try and learn some more about nuclear-powered submarines. How do they work? What are some of the pros and cons? Yvonne Yong took a look.
One thing to be clear about is that a nuclear-powered submarine is not a nuclear weapon, and Australia says its subs will not be armed with nuclear weapons. Weapons-grade uranium is 90% enriched or more. When we say enriched, that means increasing the proportion of the isotope uranium-235 in it. Uranium fuel for a nuclear-powered sub is enriched to 20% or more. But the vessels do draw power from mini nuclear reactors on board. Now, these produce energy by splitting atoms to create heat and, in turn, steam for turbines that generate electricity. So why would you go nuclear over a diesel-electric powered submarine? Firstly, they don't need to be refuelled and they don't need to come up for air and can therefore stay underwater for longer. Endurance. Whereas diesel-powered ones need to resurface regularly for oxygen and to charge their batteries. Nuclear-powered submarines are also faster, but they're a lot more expensive and larger, therefore less nimble. You do have to think about the safe disposal of the spent uranium as well, not to mention the risk of nuclear accidents. Now, 6 countries already have nuclear submarines: China, France, India, Russia, the UK and the US. China has 6 as well as 50 diesel-electric ones. But unlike these other nations, Australia does not have a nuclear industry capable of supporting the submarines. Reactor modules will need to be delivered to Australia when they would be installed in the subs.
Alexei Muravyev is an Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University in Perth, and he is with us now. Alexei, really good to talk. Let's talk about how going nuclear is going to better equip us going into the future.
Well, I mean, from the military strategic perspective, it provides the Australian Defence Force, or will provide the Australian Defence Force with further reach. We would be able to survey our maritime approaches at a greater distance, and we would be able to engage strategic targets with greater degree of lethality. I mean, as it was mentioned, nuclear-powered submarines can accommodate a far greater array of weaponry on board. They can spend and see greater deal of time. And more importantly, the very fact that an adversary will be confronted with a nuclear-powered submarine force is a sufficient enough deterrent. So that certainly provides enormous benefits to the enabler, to the user, but we also need to understand the consequences of making such a decision, whether they would be political, military, or otherwise.
Yes, so we want to talk about that more in a moment. But let's just talk about the proposition of nuclear propulsion. Scott Morrison says that's all it is. It's only about how these submarines are going to be powered. Is that all it'll be, though?
Look, I mean, at this point in time, the government would obviously want to commit to just nuclear propulsion. So by giving the Navy the platform it always wanted and required. But look, I mean, let's be frank, nuclear-powered capability, and certainly the submarines operated by both the Royal Navy and the United States Navy have a great degree of interoperability. They carry similar systems, they carry same weapon systems, both conventional and unconventional. And down the track, because we're not getting them tomorrow, we're getting them after a long period of, first of all, design, consultation, then design, then the production, then sea trials. It may take up to 10 years for the first boat to be put to water and made fully operational. And if the operational environment or there is going to be operational requirement, well, who is going to guarantee that our subs will not be armed with weapons supplied by our either British or American allies? And again, this is going to be a requirement for the Navy on needs basis rather than us formally committing to acquire nuclear weapons capability.
And so if say, the US was using one of our submarines to carry nuclear weapons, would we be in breach of the treaties that we have signed up to?
Well, this is what lawyers have to basically worry about. I mean, whether we going to have the capability to store them on land, and if we're going to have enhanced commitment with our enhanced security and defense commitments, and we're going to effectively upgrade our naval defense facilities to accommodate a fleet of nuclear powered vessels, we obviously have to have appropriate storage facilities for spares, lubricants, all the parts that will keep them going and operational. I won't rule out completely that there is not going to be special storage facilities capable of accommodating special munitions and special devices. Whether it's going to be a breach or a legal breach or not, well, look, I mean, this is what the legal experts have to look into, because once the submarine is at sea, it's away from the Australian territory. Yes, technically it's an extension of the Australian territory, but I think there would be clauses under which you can actually make an argument.
All right, let's talk about the impact with our foreign policies. Is this deal worth further alienating China over?
Look, I think we need to be very clear. Are we doing this because we want to enhance our security? And obviously, the sovereignty and the very survival of our nation is very much depends on uninterrupted access to the sea. For us to be able to carry and maintain a favorable maritime security regime. If this is the primary objective, yes, then it's a really good and a smart deal. With regards to containing China, well, yes, it's not going to be a pleasant surprise for Beijing, and I think they will be making very clear, and they have already made some expected sounds about this. Should this deter China from expanding its strategic reach into our part of the world? Should it deter China from acquiring more of its ocean-going capability? Well, to some extent, it would probably provoke a regional naval arms race, including a nuclear-powered submarine race, which will not only be limited to China, but again, this is something I keep bringing up. We need to also be mindful of the Russian Navy that operates a potent submarine force, and in the process of upgrading it with respect to its operations in the Pacific. So I think there's going to be, and we should be anticipating, a trigger response from our potential adversaries, but also some sort of a political response from a broader in the Asia-Pacific community, including from our neighbors who would also be quite anxious, if not nervous, to find out what is the true intent behind acquiring such a stealthy and deadly capability.
Alexei, the EU tonight has come out and said that this is also a serious blow in terms of their own strategic thinking going into the Indo-Pacific. The fact that we didn't really give the French much notice. The French could have probably provided us with nuclear submarines. How critical is this? How much of a blow is it going to be to other groupings and their efforts to contain China in this region?
Look, I mean, if the EU will look at this as a blow to its force posturing or its interest in the Asia Pacific, well, we need to ask Brussels a question on which side they're on. I mean, I would look at the EU as our strategic partner, as our friend, and there are obviously a number of core nations, including France, which Australia has special security, defense, as well as trade relations. Yes, it's a nasty surprise to the French, but on the other hand, business is business, and national security is a very serious business. I mean, what was promised to us when the agreement was signed at the cost of $50 billion is now turned to be something that less of a promise, but with a higher cost of almost $90 billion, and that, as far as I understand, wasn't the final price. There were also delays with expected arrival of the first platforms, and it would still be not something that would be super ideal, that the Navy would ideally wanted to acquire, because the discussion about Australia acquiring a nuclear-powered attack submarine capability was in the works for quite some time, and it was the politicians who didn't have the courage of effectively making the decision that would be in Australia's best interest here. So again, just like with our regional neighbors, just like with even our potential adversaries, that would require some careful politicking, that would require some explanation, but that what really comes with all such brave and bold decisions, that you obviously have to understand the fallout on both on the other side as well as among our friends.
Yeah. Alexei, really great to get your perspective on this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, the decision to scrap the $90 billion French submarine deal has left hundreds of workers in limbo. Questions have also been raised about future jobs in the supply chain supporting the project. The choice of a nuclear-powered vessel has also drawn a mixed reaction.
Last week, apprentice Nathan McDonald was preparing for a long career welding together French submarines.
Well, I always wanted to do something like this when I was younger, and now I've got the opportunity.
Now that's been halted. The decision to scrap Naval Group's $90 billion deal with the Commonwealth creates uncertainty for the company's 350-strong Australian workforce.
I'm not really sure how to react at the moment.
They are needed, they are wanted, and we will support them into new jobs.
There are also questions about jobs in the submarine supply chain. Local firms were promised 60% of work on the French subs, a guarantee now less clear on the nuclear-powered project.
We know that build can mean many different things, and we expect to see that unfold in the coming months.
Another 400 construction jobs on the Adelaide shipyard will also disappear, but positions will be created when work begins on the new subs years later than the French build was to start. In between, the Osborne shipyard in Adelaide's northwestern suburbs will continue servicing the current Collins-class fleet to refit it to extend its life, ending years of speculation that work could shift to Perth.
Our expectation is to see some 5,000 South Australians employed in the naval shipbuilding industries by 2030.
Some who live near the shipyard are stunned a nuclear-powered sub will be built in the neighbourhood.
I'm just in shock, really. I just can't believe that they're going to do that. Why?
And it's a proven technology now, and I'm happy to advocate that I'm pro-nuclear.
Nevertheless, it's a big shift for a country with decades of anti-nuclear sentiment and a state which only 5 years ago rejected a Royal Commission recommendation to consider storing the world's nuclear waste.
Well, I think for any government it's going to take some time. I think it's the perfect time. The catalyst is the changed circumstances. It's now about explaining what this capability brings to Australia.
Capability the military says the country now needs. Rory McLaren, ABC News, Adelaide.
So just what are the implications of having nuclear submarines based here, and will it lead to a bigger nuclear industry? Let's go to Maria Rost-Rubley. She's a nuclear expert from Monash University and has previously worked in intelligence for the United States government. Maria, really good to get you on the program. What are the immediate questions raised for you today, given this deal was announced with great fanfare, but really very little detail behind it?
Yes, well, there are lots of questions, but related to the nuclear component of the submarine deal, the first question that immediately comes to my mind and the mind of experts in the region is, who is going to supply the nuclear fuel that is going to power these subs? This is actually a really critical question. There's been a lot of fanfare about how Australia will not have nuclear weapons. These submarines will not carry nuclear weapons. But there still is the question, will Australia be creating the highly enriched uranium that's going to propel these nuclear submarines? And if so, that's going to cause diplomatic, treaty-related, environmental, social, health, political issues, a very large number of them, not to mention make regional allies and adversaries very nervous. If, on the other hand, the U.S. is going to be supplying this highly enriched uranium, a very dangerous nuclear substance, then that alleviates some of the concerns, but not all of them.
Yeah. So if the US were to provide that enriched uranium to us for the propulsion of these submarines, how would it work?
Well, basically, it's as though we had a nuclear power plant, and this happens all around the world. Most countries with nuclear power don't actually create their own enriched fuel for it. Instead, they get fuel rods. In our case, we would get fuel rods for the mini nuclear power plant inside the submarines. And in the case of nuclear submarines, the way the U.S. designs them, they're designed to be fueled only once, so we don't have to worry about refueling accidents. And so they're just delivered to Australia as part of the mini nuclear power plant. However, that doesn't mitigate all the risks. There can be. What about when the nuclear sub is in dry dock? How is that handled? Where will they be held? What if there are accidents while they're at sea in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? We have to remember that Australia does not have a nuclear industry. I mean, we do have ANSTO, some of the world-leading experts in terms of medical and nuclear-related civilian research, but nothing related to military applications. There's no depth here. And so how do we expect to have Australians running nuclear subs handling this very dangerous material, not to mention the risks of potential accidents, which is relatively low given that the U.S. designs are pretty safe, but you never can tell, especially when you have people who haven't been trained on these types of materials their entire lives the way they have in the U.S.
And so, Maria, how hard is it going to be to pivot then the industry in Adelaide from, the type of submarines they've been building to these nuclear submarines? And to your point, is it not time that Australia developed this knowledge?
Well, it will be a big pivot. The U.S. design is very, very different from the French design. Not just that in terms of it was non-nuclear. It was a conventional propelled rather than nuclear propelled. But the U.S. design there are a lot of differences. So basically, a lot of the work is going to have to be scrapped and redone. Of course, we have the gap between people that were actually working on it right now, and they're not going to, be working on the U.S. nuclear subs for at least a couple of years. And so where do these people work? How do we keep people employed who have expertise? In terms of creating the type of training that we need in Australia, absolutely. And in fact, the nuclear industry has been talking about this for a while. My understanding, there's only one nuclear engineering course in the entire country. And it was even hard to get that started up, and there only a handful of students in it. So, there are so many issues related to this, sudden announcement, not the least of which are things like practical questions, HR questions, education type questions. How are we going to have enough people, submariners, construction workers, people who can handle the submarines while they're in dry dock, et cetera. There's a lot of complications. And my concern of a lot of people is that these haven't been sorted through, that it's just, we have this warm glow, the U.S. sharing this sensitive technology with us. We're just happy to be part of that without understanding exactly what we're committing to and whether or not we have the national capacity to actually pull it off.
Yeah, there was this sort of kind of sense of naivety which a lot of analysts have commented on. Do you think there was a simpler option for us to partner with the US and the UK in this region, given we know that there are great concerns about China's increased aggression in the region?
Yes, well, there are a lot of options other than nuclear powered subs. And certainly, people have been saying that the one good thing about this is that we've gotten out of the deal with the French, which really I was a critic of and many other people were a critic of for a number of reasons, not the least of which the cost was too much to begin with and then has almost doubled and probably would have gone further. But for example, South Korea has just done a 30-month intense examination, and they're using, electric submarines. They've decided that's what will work for them. I'm not saying that would necessarily be what would work best for Australia. There's good reason to think about nuclear-powered submarines because Australia has a huge maritime space to consider. But there are also significant disadvantages of nuclear submarines, which don't seem to be considered at all in this debate.
Yeah. And just finally, Maria, there's often been a debate in Australia about whether we should enrich uranium. We have uranium. We could be enriching it and selling it. Do you think that would be too tricky a discussion and a debate to now have?
Well, yes, this debate has come up multiple times. For example, with the most recent Royal Commission in South Australia on this, whether or not nuclear waste should be taken and you can reprocess it and take out useful nuclear material and then resell it. And the analysis was that it actually doesn't make economic sense right now because the uranium doesn't sell for that much because a lot of decommissioned nuclear weapons, the nuclear fuel is then used for civilian purposes. But there's a larger issue here. There are very few countries in the world that enrich uranium. If you can enrich uranium for a power plant or for a nuclear submarine, you use the exact same equipment to enrich it for nuclear weapons. And so countries in the region would be shocked and startled if Australia said, we're going to be enriching uranium. The US, in fact, has led an effort against the highly enriched uranium remaining in sites around the world and against countries trying to get enrichment technology. And so, for example, South Korea has been arguing, why can't we enrich uranium? We depend heavily on nuclear power, and the US has really pressured against that, and in fact was able to talk South Korea out of sort of demanding that. Yeah. And so it's a political hot button. It would regionally and globally have all sorts of repercussions. It's not just a matter of sort of domestic Australian interests.
Yeah. Really great to chat to you tonight, Maria. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.
And that's your World for tonight. You can see more world news and interviews at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. Good night.